The Viking Age, stretching from the late 8th century to the mid-11th, has always fascinated both scholars and the general public. Known for their seafaring skill, trading networks, and exploration that reached as far as North America, the Norse also carried with them a reputation for violence. Among the most infamous tales associated with them is something called the Blood Eagle. For centuries, this concept has stirred debate, fear, and fascination. But what was the Blood Eagle really? Was it a horrific ritual execution carried out by the Vikings, or simply a piece of propaganda spread by their enemies? The story begins in the sagas and chronicles that describe Viking deeds. According to medieval texts, the Blood Eagle was a punishment reserved for the worst of enemies, betrayers, rivals, or those who killed kin. The ritual, as described in later accounts, involved a symbolic act meant to display power, vengeance, and divine justice. Yet these accounts are anything but straightforward. They are often wrapped in poetic metaphors, translated centuries after the event supposedly occurred, and filtered through Christian scribes who had their own reasons for portraying pagan practices in the darkest possible light. One of the earliest references to this act is found in the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, where it is said that one of Ragnar's killers was executed with a blood eagle. This detail alone has given the story incredible staying power. Ragnar himself may be more legend than historical figure, but his story, woven from Norse oral tradition and later written sagas, was central to how Vikings were remembered. If such a gruesome method was truly practiced, it would show the Norse as not only warriors, but also practitioners of extreme symbolic justice. However, historians urge caution. The sagas were written down in Iceland 2 to 3 centuries after the Viking Age had ended. That means the stories were filtered through generations of retelling, shaped by political needs, and framed within a Christian worldview. The imagery of eagles, wings, and breaking the human body might not have been literal at all. Instead, it may have been poetic language, symbolizing the destruction of an enemy and offering them to Odin, the god of war and wisdom, who was often associated with ravens and birds of prey. The phrase blood eagle itself may have been a metaphor misunderstood by later readers. In skaldic poetry, which was dense with kennings, poetic riddles, and metaphors, phrases like carving the eagle or feeding the eagle were common. They did not mean actual carving of wings into flesh. They meant killing in battle and leaving bodies for scavenger birds. When a skald described a warrior as cutting the eagle, it meant he slew so many foes that eagles and ravens would feast. If a later scribe misunderstood such imagery, it could easily transform a battlefield metaphor into the legend of a ritualized execution. It's important to remember that Vikings were not a single unified culture, but a collection of Scandinavian societies, each with its own traditions. To them, honor and revenge were deeply important. Killing an enemy in a way that demonstrated power and ensured remembrance could be symbolic. But whether they truly enacted the blood eagle is another question. Archaeology has not uncovered clear physical evidence of this method. Skeletons with extreme trauma exist, but nothing that can be definitively tied to such a practice. So why does the story persist? Part of the answer lies in the nature of medieval propaganda. Enemies of the Norse Anglo-Saxons, Franks, and Christian chroniclers had every reason to portray Vikings as brutal, godless savages. By spreading tales of ritual executions, they justified their own wars against them. To say the pagans performed the blood eagle was to cast them as monstrous, beyond the bounds of human decency, and in need of eradication. The image was powerful, shocking, and lasting. Yet another part of the story's endurance comes from the fascination of later centuries. In the Romantic era, when medieval sagas were rediscovered and translated, the most sensational details were emphasized. The image of a Viking cutting open an enemy became irresistible for writers and artists seeking to depict a wild, barbaric past. Modern television series and novels have only added fuel to the fire, often presenting the blood eagle in graphic detail for shock value, while historical nuance is left behind. The truth, however, is far murkier. The blood eagle exists at the intersection of history, myth, poetry, and propaganda. Its most detailed descriptions come from texts written long after the supposed events by authors who may have had little understanding of the original meaning of the metaphors they copied. It could have been real, a terrifying ritual of vengeance. It could have been misunderstood poetry, twisted into a tale of horror. Or it could have been an invention of Viking enemies, designed to stain their reputation forever. The question remains, did Vikings actually perform this act, or has history exaggerated their brutality through misinterpretation and fear? The evidence so far points in conflicting directions, leaving historians, linguists, and archaeologists debating a practice that may never have existed in reality. When examining the blood eagle, one of the most important aspects is the written record. Unlike Viking ships, jewelry, or weapons, which archaeologists can uncover and study directly, the blood eagle survives almost entirely in texts. This means that the practice is filtered through layers of language, translation, and cultural bias. To understand whether the act was real, one must look closely at where the descriptions come from and how they were written. The clearest references appear in a handful of Icelandic sagas and in medieval poetry. The saga of Orkneyinga, written in the early 13th century, describes Earl Torf Einar performing the blood eagle on Halfdan Longleg, a rival killed after a battle. The saga says he carved an eagle on his back in vengeance. Another tale appears in the legendary saga of Ragnar's sons, where Ivar the Boneless supposedly used the blood eagle on King Ella of Northumbria, who had executed Ragnar. Later chronicles written by Christian authors in England echoed this story, reinforcing the idea of the ritual. But here is the difficulty. These texts were written centuries after the supposed events, long after eyewitnesses could confirm details. The sagas themselves were products of an Icelandic literary culture that thrived in the 13th century. By that time, Iceland was Christian, and Norse paganism was a distant memory. The authors often used stories to entertain, moralize, and connect their society to a dramatic, heroic past. That makes them rich in symbolism but unreliable as literal accounts. Linguistic analysis also complicates the picture. Scholars have pointed out that Old Norse poetry is filled with kennings metaphors that replace simple words with elaborate imagery. For example, instead of saying the sea, a skald might say the whale road. Instead of saying battle, he might say storm of swords. In this context, phrases about carving the eagle could simply mean slaying someone in battle so that carrion birds would feast. If medieval scribes misunderstood these metaphors, they could have interpreted them literally as a ritual of carving an eagle into flesh. Another layer comes from Christian chroniclers. Anglo-Saxon sources describing Viking attacks often emphasized their cruelty. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, for instance, records raids in England with horror, painting the Norsemen as a scourge sent by God to punish the sinful. In such a climate, adding stories of shocking executions would have seemed believable and persuasive. It made the enemy appear less like ordinary humans and more like agents of chaos and destruction. Historians also consider whether the blood eagle might have been more symbolic than literal. If a Viking leader declared he would cut the eagle on arrival, it might have meant staging a dramatic execution without necessarily following the detailed descriptions that later writers provided. Perhaps the body of the victim was marked or displayed with eagle imagery, signifying that they had been offered to Odin. Eagles and ravens were associated with the battlefield and the divine, so invoking these birds carried spiritual weight. This symbolic interpretation would explain the presence of the motif in poetry and saga without requiring an anatomically impossible or impractical ritual. From a practical perspective, many historians are skeptical about the literal descriptions. The sagas suggest that the victim would be cut open and reshaped in ways that modern anatomy tells us would be nearly impossible without advanced surgical tools. Vikings were skilled in many crafts, but their medical knowledge was limited. Such a procedure would have been extremely difficult to perform, especially in the heat of revenge or battle. The likelihood that it was repeated in several different contexts seems low. Yet not all scholars dismiss the practice entirely. Some argue that while the sagas may have exaggerated the details, there could have been a kernel of truth. Extreme executions were not unknown in medieval Europe. Burning at the stake, drawing and quartering, or impaling were all methods used at various times and places. It is possible that the Vikings, too, practiced some form of shocking punishment that left a deep impression on enemies. Later storytellers may have turned it into the legendary Blood Eagle. Archaeology adds a frustrating silence to the debate. Although many Viking graves contain weapons, jewelry, and bones bearing marks of violence, none provide clear evidence of the Blood Eagle. Certain skeletons show signs of trauma consistent with execution, but whether they fit the description of this specific act is impossible to say. Without physical proof, the Blood Eagle remains tied to words rather than artifacts. Still, the absence of evidence does not necessarily mean the act never occurred. Many rituals, punishments, and cultural practices leave no archaeological trace. If the Blood Eagle was rare, symbolic, or carried out only a handful of times, its physical remains may never be found. This uncertainty fuels the ongoing debate. Was it a historical reality or only a literary invention? Ultimately, the Blood Eagle serves as an example of how myth and history become entangled. It reflects the way Norse culture has been remembered not only as explorers and traders, but as fierce warriors capable of extraordinary cruelty. Whether or not the Blood Eagle was real, its presence in medieval literature tells us much about how the Vikings were perceived, feared, and perhaps even how they wished to be remembered. The Blood Eagle occupies a unique place in Viking lore because it straddles the line between fearsome reality and symbolic imagination. To understand its significance, it helps to look at what purpose such a story would serve, whether real or invented. For the Vikings themselves, reputation and honor were central to identity. A warrior's fame lived longer than his body, and tales of extraordinary deeds were what secured immortality and memory. In such a society, stories of dramatic vengeance served as powerful lessons. Whether or not the Blood Eagle was ever physically carried out, the idea that a leader could command such terrifying justice would have sent a strong message to both allies and enemies. In the brutal logic of the early medieval world, deterrence was as valuable as victory. If the ritual was symbolic, it might have been performed more for theater than for torture. Public displays of power executions, sacrifices, or staged punishments were common across many cultures. The Blood Eagle could have functioned as a form of ritualized intimidation, where the exact physical process was less important than the impression it left. Witnesses, or even just listeners, would remember the story and spread it, amplifying its effect until it became legend. On the other hand, if the Blood Eagle was mostly a literary invention, its survival tells us something about how narratives evolve. The image of the Vikings as merciless raiders was cultivated not only by their foes, but also by later storytellers who found value in dramatizing the past. Medieval monks, who preserved the sagas, often sought to portray pagan practices as barbaric, thereby reinforcing Christian moral superiority. By recording such tales, they shaped how history would view the Norse, not merely as farmers and traders, but as bloodthirsty heathens in need of conversion. In the modern age, the story has taken on a life of its own. From 19th century romantic writers to 21st century television dramas, the Blood Eagle has been depicted as the ultimate symbol of Viking brutality. It plays into the fascination with the dark side of history, where violence, ritual, and myth intertwine. Yet each retelling says as much about the era producing it as about the Vikings themselves. In Victorian times, the ritual was used to highlight the supposed savagery of the pre-Christian world. In modern pop culture, it often serves as shock value, satisfying audiences who seek a more sensational view of the past. For historians and archaeologists, however, the focus lies on separating fact from fiction. The lack of physical evidence, the reliance on metaphorical language, and the political motivations of medieval writers all suggest caution. Most modern scholars lean toward the idea that the blood eagle, as vividly described in later sources, was not a common or literal practice. Instead, it was either a poetic metaphor, misunderstood by later readers, or a piece of propaganda, deliberately exaggerated to blacken the Norse reputation. Still, the possibility remains that some version of the act may have occurred. Human history is filled with examples of extreme punishments used as displays of power. The Vikings were no strangers to spectacle and symbolism. While the blood eagle in its most detailed form may never have been performed, some execution or ritual involving eagle imagery might have existed and given rise to the legend. What is certain is that the blood eagle reflects the intersection of myth, propaganda, and cultural memory. It demonstrates how stories can be shaped by fear, retelling, and misunderstanding, until they take on a life independent of reality. For the Vikings, it may have been a metaphor of battle or vengeance. For their enemies, it became a story of horror used to justify resistance. For later generations, it evolved into one of the most memorable images of the Viking Age. In the end, whether fact or propaganda, the blood eagle reminds us that history is never just about events. It is also about the stories we tell, the symbols we create, and the ways we choose to remember. The Vikings left behind ships, settlements, and trade routes, but they also left behind legends, some true, some exaggerated, and some perhaps never real at all. The blood eagle, perched between these categories, continues to fascinate precisely because it captures that uncertainty. It asks us to question how much of what we believe about the past is grounded in fact, and how much is the product of imagination. By exploring the blood eagle, we uncover not just a single ritual, but the way history itself is constructed, layered with poetry, colored by bias, and retold across centuries. In that sense, the blood eagle may not be a literal act, but it is very much real as a cultural phenomenon. It tells us about fear, power, and the enduring ability of stories to shape our view of the past.